everybody, Richard again here from Electric Classic Cars, and we're going to do a tech talk today. This time it's going to be all about electric vehicles versus hydrogen fuel cell technology versus synthetic fuels, and we're going to be comparing it on various different angles, from the energy efficiency of the production through to carbon emissions, and at the end I want to kind of do a cost comparison as well. So let's start off with who am I and why should you even be listening to what I say? Because I'm a car guy. What do I know about energy and carbon emissions and things like this? Well, more than you think, actually, because before I started converting vehicles to electric, for 15 years of my life, I was in the energy industry, and primarily in software systems which were monitoring and measuring the energy consumption and calculating the carbon emissions for organizations off the back of energy data. For instance, organizations like Tesco's and Walmart and British Telecom. But at the same time, our systems were also used in national grid type organizations and energy suppliers like British Gas, npower, etc., for essentially energy monitoring and balancing of the grid. So from a supplier to a generator, and kind of forecasting the amount of energy they might need for today, tomorrow, and the next year. So I kind of lived and breathed in the energy efficiency and energy industry and emissions calculations for about 15 years of my life. And at the same time as I was doing that, saving sort of carbon emissions through my day job, I was putting them back up there in the weekends with my good friend Tim as we were doing rallying. So there was good and there was bad. So that's why I've got quite a decent depth of knowledge when it comes to kilowatt hours and grams of carbon dioxide, etc., etc. Yeah, I mean, I'm not in a unique position, but the fact I know that world and the car world gives me a good sort of like knowledge to be able to talk about this stuff. So let's get into it, and there's going to be lots of numbers. So because we're getting techie, I'm going to put the glasses on because then I'll look intelligent for a change. Right, I can't see anything in these. Right, okay, so what have we got here? Well, we've got a nice matrix of information that I'm going to fill, and we're going to be looking at electric vehicles versus hydrogen fuel cell technology, not hydrogen combustion, because that's so new at the moment that it's not possible to do a proper analysis of this. And then we're going to look at synthetic fuels. So I'm going to take these off because they're going to fall off in a minute. So synthetic fuels are essentially not like biofuels. Biofuels are kind of made from crops, if you like, or byproducts of crops. Synthetic fuels is essentially where you're taking, it's still a hydrocarbon-based fuel, but essentially what you're doing is you're taking carbon from, say, the atmosphere, and you're adding that to hydrogen, and you're essentially synthetically making a hydrocarbon-based fuel, petrol, if you like. So that's what synthetic fuel is. It's essentially just not taking the hydrocarbons out of the ground, like digging that oil out and processing that into fuel. What you're doing is you're taking carbon that's already in the atmosphere and you're combining it with hydrogen to make a hydrocarbon-based fuel. So on the face of it, you think, oh, that's quite good, because that's kind of like a circular system for carbon capture, because you're taking it out of the atmosphere, putting it into an engine, and then it comes out of the exhaust and goes back up there. Good on the skin deep aspect, but let's see if the numbers back that up. Okay, so let's start with welter tank. So what is welter tank? Well, as you might think, it's essentially the process of getting that the energy into your fuel tank or battery pack, or whatever you've got. So we're going to assume, and there's a bigger word there, assume, because these guys always like to say we get our fuel, or we can get our fuel from renewable sources whenever they compare to electric vehicles or petrol. Well, if you're going to play that game, electric vehicles are going to play that game too. So let's just assume that all the electricity and energy comes from renewable fuels in this case. So we're going to start with 100% of energy for each one of these. And what we're going to do as we go down is see how much energy is lost through each process. Okay. So for electric vehicles, essentially you've got your energy coming in here. Let's say there's a big wind turbine up here, and try not to draw a rude thing. There you go. Looks like a flower, but it's a wind turbine. So from that wind turbine, how much energy is then lost to get into the battery pack for electric vehicle? Well, essentially, it's going to end up with 94% by the time that electricity or energy, if you like, has got into the electric vehicle tank or battery. Hydrogen's a bit more complicated because you've got a few more processes to go through, and any time you're going through a process, essentially you're losing energy because nothing is 100% efficient. So you've got like electrolysis there, transportation, storage, distribution. So by the time you've finished all that and put that hydrogen into somebody's tank, it's about 68% of the energy you've got left. So 68% there. By the time it gets into the tank. Now, synthetic fuels, it's on a hiding to nothing, unfortunately, because essentially you've got to make a synthetic fuel from hydrogen. So you've got to do all of this, plus then you've got to do carbon capture. Then you've got to convert that, power, if you like, that CO2 and the hydrogen into a liquid. And then you've still got to transport it, storage, distribution, etc. on top. So by the time you finished all that, I'm afraid you've got down to just 55% of the energy left by the time that it goes into the tank. But that's only half the story, because now you've got the energy in your tank or your battery. You've now got to make that vehicle move. So there's more inefficiencies in that to take into account. And that's what's called the tank to wheel. So from the tank to wheel for an electric vehicle, you've got charging infrastructure, so there's a little bit that gets lost there in inefficiencies of the charger, battery inefficiency, converting it from DC that a battery has to AC that a motor wants, and then the actual motor efficiency itself. So by the time you've gone through all of that there, you're down to essentially 77%. So now you're left with 77% of the energy that you started with that's turned into motion. Now for hydrogen, well, again there, it's you've got to start with the hydrogen. You've got to convert that into electric, because that's essentially what it is. And again, a hydrogen vehicle is nothing more than an electric vehicle with a hydrogen fuel cell, fuel station, if you like, on the vehicle. So it still has a battery. It's still kind of like, it weighs the same, if not weighs more actually, than an electric vehicle. So you've got to convert that hydrogen into electric. You've got battery inefficiencies to deal with. You've got DC to AC conversion going on, and motor efficiencies, just like in an electric vehicle. So by the time you finish this, I'm afraid you are left with 33%. And all these figures I'm going to put up in the link or in the description of the video for the sources of information for things like this, because you're probably wondering, where have you pulled these numbers from, Moggy? So we're going to put the links and papers where this information comes from. So where are we now? So that is hydrogen, synthetic fuels. Okay, not off to a great start, but it's got less things to go through to make this thing go. So surely it's going to catch up. Not so much. Engine efficiencies. Unfortunately, your typical engine, because don't forget, this is nothing more than, petrol, if you like. It's a hydrocarbon-based fuel still. So it's still going into a combustion engine, and those things are not efficient to turn, your fuel into motion. They're, usually around about 30% efficient. So by the time the energy's got through all that, you're unfortunately down to about 16%. Now, there's various different studies out there, and there's always a best case, worst case scenario. So what I've actually put down here is kind of the best case that I've found. And actually, if I put down the worst case, so I've found in some studies, this is as low as 69%. And for hydrogen, it's as low as 23%. And for synthetic fuels, The lowest I found is 6%, which is awful. So, I mean, you can do the maths if you've got a phone or a calculator to hand, but you can see one of the problems you've got with hydrogen and synthetic fuels is essentially you are multiples behind electric vehicles. So by the time the energy goes into motion, electric vehicle is many times more efficient than synthetic fuels and hydrogen. Now, it's not, you're living in cloud cuckoo land, let's say, is a polite way to put it, if you think all of this is going to come from renewable sources. It's just not there quite yet. And I'm talking from the UK. And we're pretty good as far as the carbon emissions of our grid is concerned. About a third of our electricity is generated from renewable sources, like wind, solar, hydro, etc. A third comes from low carbon fuels like nuclear, for instance, which isn't great, but nuclear's carbon, not carbon neutral, but it's not as bad as carbon-based fuels like gas, for instance, which then covers the other third of our electricity generation in the UK. And coal is only, I think it's less than 2% of our electricity generation now. So it's the easiest way to think of it is a third is gas, a third is renewables, and a third is low carbon sources. But that means that you've still got carbon emissions going up from the grid. So if this was done in the UK, and why wouldn't it be? It would be great rather than getting synthetic fuels from halfway around the world to be able to produce it in the UK. The UK average for the national grid in 2021, just to explain how I did that, I downloaded all of the information, and I'm talking half-hourly data for a whole year into a spreadsheet, and then calculate, because I have access to that information, and so do you actually, because I'll give you a link to that. And you can download it into a spreadsheet and look for yourself and calculate this in Excel. Other spreadsheets are available. So the average UK carbon emissions for 2021 was 174. So that's 174 grams of carbon per carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. And obviously that depends on where you live in the country. Some areas in the country are higher, some are a lot lower, but that's the average. And for hydrogen, obviously, if we were making the hydrogen in the UK, you've got to take into account the many multiples that you've got to put in because of the inefficiencies. In fact, let me get a calculator. What is it? And I knew I would need a calculator, so I had one to hand. So let's have a look. So it's literally 2.3 times more energy you'd need for hydrogen. Best case scenario. Worst case scenario, let's have a look. That's 69, 23. So that's 3. Ooh, 3. So we got 174 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. So we need to multiply that now by, say, 2.3. So 1.74 times 2.3. So that is 400. So we got 400 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour for hydrogen. And then, so 174 times 4.8, so 835 for synthetic fuels if it was made on the UK national grid. Now let's look at the worst case scenario. So let's have a look. So 174 times 3, so that would be 522. And 174 times 11.5, 2001. So now you get an idea as to why these guys always wave around the renewables banner saying, no, we can make it from renewables. And you see synthetic fuel barrels with wind turbine fields behind them, because they know they haven't got a hope in hell of being able to convince people that this is viable without it being produced via renewable sources. Because essentially, if it was produced on the national grid in the UK, the amount of emissions would be astronomical because of how energy intensive these processes are. And it's also worth mentioning, actually, that if you look at the UK national grid and talk to most electric vehicle owners, and this one thing I recommend whenever you're making any decisions, whether or not it's electric vehicles or anything, is you don't go off other people's opinions, you go off other people's experience. And usual experience with electric vehicle is you charge it up overnight, and the national grid is a more carbon efficient national grid at night time. So what I've actually done with the data that I downloaded, I looked at how much the carbon emissions of the grid is during night periods, if you like, and I looked at it between midnight and 4 o'clock. And I'll explain why I did that later, actually, those specific times. And the national grid then is around about 151 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. So there we go. It's not a good situation. And you've got to understand another thing about hydrogen. Hydrogen, the large proportion of it, in fact, it's in the 90+%, is made as a byproduct of the petroleum industry. And you can understand now why big oil, if you like, likes pushing it. And synthetic fuels is a complete shoe-in for the petroleum industry. And when you consider that the petroleum industry has trillions of dollars of assets out there, from petrol stations to tankers to fuel refineries, etc., all that in the next decade or few decades is going to just be written off. So, they're looking for a nice shoe-in, and believe me, that just slots straight in to be able to push onto the world. So that's why you'll see a lot of petrochemical based organizations pushing synthetic fuels, but also car automakers. And you might think, why would a car automaker be pushing synthetic fuels? Well, don't forget, a lot of their business model comes from servicing and maintenance of vehicles. And with electric vehicles, it's just simply not there because they are very reliable, need hardly any servicing, etc. But that old combustion engine, put synthetic fuels in, happy days, we've got our service model back and our parts model back, etc. So you'll see some manufacturers also pushing this as well, because it's kind of like, good for them, if you like. Right, where are we at now? Tailpipe emissions. That's an important one, because don't forget, synthetic fuels, it's carbon neutral. Surely you're pulling the carbon out of the air, and then you're putting it back up there out the tailpipe. Okay, so tailpipe emissions. Electric, well, 0, because there's no tailpipe. Hydrogen, good as well, because it's just water that comes out of that. So that's a big fat 0 as well. Synthetic fuels. Now, this is a hydrocarbon-based fuel. It's going into a combustion engine, and the emissions out the tailpipe, it's the same as petrol. So it's literally same as petrol, which means all that lovely stuff like CO2, your nitrous oxide, your sulfur dioxide, all that is still coming out of the exhaust. So if you put synthetic fuel into your big Range Rover and go and pick up the kids from school and think you're all that, well, bear in mind there's still nasty stuff coming out that tailpipe that's essentially clogging up those lungs of those kids. So just bear that in mind as well when you're thinking about synthetic fuels. So there we go. That's a sum up of electric vehicles versus hydrogen versus synthetic fuels. And next I'm going to look at, on this board behind me, and costs, as well as some other things. Now, before I go on to costs, I tried my very best to do an analysis of cost of electric vehicles versus hydrogen and synthetic fuels. And I felt it was very unfair to do that, because electric has been produced for some time now. Hydrogen and synthetic fuels is very, very new. So you'd expect the costs of those to be astronomically high, which it is. So I didn't feel comfortable that it was fair to compare electric vehicles to hydrogen synthetic fuels, because essentially that infrastructure and that is just simply not there yet, and the economies of scale is nowhere near. So it's unfair to do that. So what I'm going to do next is compare electric vehicles to good old petrol and see what the costs come out there. And yeah, let's fill in that board next. Right, so what I'm going to do here is compare an electric vehicle to a petrol vehicle. And I've chosen a Tesla Model 3 and a BMW 330i because they're fairly comparative vehicles. They're both around about the £42,000 mark. They both do 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. So it's a comparative vehicle choice that I've made there. And we're going to compare things like emissions, costs, and things like that. So let's have a stab at that. So the first thing we need to do to establish the emissions, which is essentially your grams of carbon per mile, you need things like your kilowatt hour per mile figures for a Tesla Model 3, and then you need to multiply that by the average carbon emissions of the grid in the UK or wherever your country is. So that's what I've got down here. So if we come down here a little bit, what you'll see is I've calculated out that it's 42 grams of carbon per mile, but you'll also see another figure here of 36 grams of carbon per mile. And if you remember before, we calculated that it was 151, was it? Yeah, 151 grams of carbon during nighttime charging, and that's between 0 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And essentially, that's why I've got two figures. So this is just off the average for the grid, and this is nighttime charging, which most electric vehicle owners would charge their cars overnight. So let's put those figures in. So we've got 42, and I'll put the number up here, 36 best case scenario. Okay, so next would be the BMW 330i, 330, I don't know what you call it, the Beamer. Let's just call it the Beamer. Next would be the Beamer. So with the Beamer, what have we got? Well, essentially, it's kind of a stated figure that you can quite easily find out for petrol, and that is 216 grams of carbon per mile. A lot of people say, oh, this is the carbon emissions of the vehicle. Let's compare that to an electric vehicle. Well, an electric vehicle carbon emissions includes the production of the electric, the transportation of that electric, and then basically going into the vehicle. And this is just tailpipe emissions. So you need to add another 30% onto that figure to be able to include the production and distribution of the fuel. So even though it's 216 out of the tailpipe, it ends up being 280 grams of carbon per mile. So if we put that in, 280. Now, I'm going to put in the multiplication sort of things here, so we've got an idea of what the difference is here. So essentially, 42 into 280, it's 6.7, and 7.8 up here. So if we're comparing a vehicle that is charged up overnight, as I say, most electric vehicles are, essentially the amount of carbon emissions compared to a petrol is 7.8 times more. So you're putting 7.8 times more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per mile with a modern vehicle. And bear in mind, a lot of vehicles out there are not as efficient as a brand spanking new Beamer. So that's that. Let's do costs. Now, costs is, again, follow me down here. So for costs, you've got to take into account now, I'm basing this off our Tesla Model 3 standard. We actually have, my wife has a standard, and you get around about 220 miles at a full tank. I know the book would say more, but that's the realistic miles we're getting out of it. And again, the book will say it's a 50 kilowatt hour battery pack, I think it is, but it's actually a 40 kilowatt hour usable battery pack. So that's how much energy actually really goes into the battery pack. So if you calculate that out at 30 pence, which is kind of like today's price for electricity, and just a note on that, that annoys me, electricity has gone up, because essentially electricity has only gone up in the UK because the gas price has gone up. And remember what I said before, gas only accounts for a third of our electricity generation. So why on earth is gas dictating our electricity pricing? Anyway, rant over. So 30 pence per kilowatt hour. You put all those together and you'll come up with 5.45 as a figure for cost per mile. So it's £5.45 to do 100 miles. And you'll see, sorry, you're going up and down like a yo-yo, I know, but down here, I've got a lesser figure. And that's because that nighttime charging that I was talking about, when the grid is less carbon emitting, it's also cheaper electricity as well. So a lot of people that have electric vehicles have an EV friendly tariff, which is a little bit, for those that are of a certain age, a little bit like the Economy 7 electricity tariffs of old, where the nighttime electricity is cheaper. So, and that's what I'm on. Sounds like a plug, but I'll tell you, I'm on Octopus Go tariff, for those that want to check out the tariff, and it's 7.5 pence between the hours of midnight 30 and 4:30 in the morning. So all our cars charge up during those hours. So calculating nighttime charging, it actually ends up being £1.36 to go 100 miles. So we'll put that back up here. So £1.36. Okay, BMW time. So Beamer, where are we at now? So Beamer, I've got down, I don't have a Beamer, but I've taken the book value, and they should never be believed, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say the book is accurate. 40 miles per gallon for the Beamer. And presently, I've calculated from litres to gallons, it's £5.90 per gallon, which is shocking, quite frankly, compared to 7 years ago when I stopped using petrol, apart from filling up the testosterone the other day. So 40 miles per gallon, £5.90 per gallon. Let's put that up here. So that essentially is £14.75 to go 100 miles. And that is essentially 2.7 times more expensive than an electric vehicle, and 10.8 times more expensive than charging it at night time. And I know there's people shouting at the screen right now going, hang on a minute, not all your electricity is charged up at home. Well, no, it's not. But you've got to bear in mind that most of it is. For electric car owners, the vast majority of charging is done at home. And now there's people shouting at the screen, I can't charge up at home. I'll come to that. So at some point, like we went to Minifest, wasn't it, on Sunday, at some point you may well stop for 10 minutes and charge up on a motorway service station, and public chargers are usually more expensive. But when I looked at the figures for the Tesla, actually it all balances out with free charging. So the amount of chargers out there that are free, for instance, when we go to Tesco's and shop, you put it on charge, the electricity is for free. And the amount of kilowatt hours we put over the year in from free chargers versus public chargers, which are a little bit more expensive, it actually balances out. So it's not as simple as you might think in that respect. And people that don't have off-street parking, then yes, you are completely correct. This would be more expensive. But you'll have to calculate that out, because I haven't done that calculation. But you are correct. It wouldn't be as cheap as this, but it certainly won't be as expensive as that. Okay, so that is pricing to go 100 miles. I thought it was an interesting exercise. What's the average UK miles done in a year? And pre-COVID, it was 7,000 miles the average person travels in their car. Obviously, COVID times, it went down for a few years, but that's probably going to go back up very shortly. So for a number of years, 7,000 was the figure that everybody used. So using that figure, we should have £381 a year you'll spend to do that for electric vehicle, and 1,030, let's put that there, £1,032 for a petrol vehicle. And let's bear in mind that actually if you were charging up at night time, it would be £95. £95 compared to £1,000. And one other thing with my situation and a lot of other electric vehicle owners out there, you know, those are sort of people that have solar panels quite often on their roof. So that also pushes these in a more positive way as well for emissions and for the cost, because for a lot of the time during the summer, I actually charge up off solar panels, which reduces your carbon emissions and also your costs. And I certainly don't have a petrol station or an oil well, if you like, in my back garden. And neither have I ever come across a free petrol station, but I've come across lots and lots and lots of free charging points. So there we are. I think that's it. That's my comparison. And I'm conscious that I might be sounding like an EV evangelist here, but you've got to bear in mind that I'm not. I mean, I was a petrol head all of my life up until about 7 years ago, when I found the power of electric. And it's just a nice side. And when I say power, I'm talking about under your foot power. And it's just a nice byproduct that actually it's good for the environment. But I'm trying not to be an EV evangelist here. Any type of fuel or transportation that reduces the emissions and impact of the pollution that we're putting up into the atmosphere is a good thing. I just believe in the facts, and the facts for personal transportation is that electric vehicles are by far and away you know, more beneficial than petrol, synthetic fuels or hydrogen, but then by no means the solution for other forms of transportation, you know, heavy haulage, ships, aviation, etc., etc. Batteries just aren't going to cut it there. So that's where you need to keep an eye on hydrogen, for instance, and other, you know, solutions like that for that type of industry. But the horse is kind of already bolted for car transportation, and anybody that thinks hydrogen is going to come back in that respect, just look at the numbers. They really need to come up with you know, an out-of-the-box type solution for producing hydrogen or synthetic fuels, because it's a very, very, very energy-intensive process. And on that bombshell, I think we'll finish. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that tech talk today. No doubt it's going to be really controversial. I might have got some numbers wrong somewhere. Probably some data analyst is going to tell me, and that's fine. I'm always listening out to people that can correct me in bits and pieces like this, and I will hold my hands up if I'm wrong with stuff. So yeah, let me know what you thought of that video. Hopefully you found it interesting, and I'll catch you on the next video.